Okay, so we left off with this exciting encounter, this daring episode, daring and dramatic episode on the threshing floor where Ruth, under Naomi's guidance and instruction, boldly approaches Boaz, and we've seen how he's responded. She said, "Spread your wings over your servant." That's really where we sort of ended up. But then, after Boaz makes a promise, and he essentially says in verse 13, the way we might say it at the end of verse 13 is, "I swear to God, I promise before the Lord," he takes a solemn oath, "that I will redeem you." But remember we said there's this pattern in Ruth where there is a problem and then we see a resolution. But then that introduces another problem. And the problem here is, even though Ruth has essentially proposed to Boaz, and Boaz has rejoiced and graciously accepted and lavished this praise upon her, there is still another kinsman redeemer who is closer in relation to Naomi, who has a priority over Boaz and has a right to redeem the property and Ruth along with it ahead of Boaz. So what's going to happen now? So it creates this tension again. So the Hallmark Christmas movie watching has started in earnest, and there's a new one with Lacey Chabert on last night, Christmas in Rome. And of course the plot is exactly the same as all the other ones, only there's all the pretty stuff in Rome to look at. But it looks like everything is going so smooth and so well. And of course, what was the plot problem that's introduced? Well, just when they're going to get together, his boss back in New York needs him to fly back. It's always on Christmas. There's always a mean boss. You have to work on Christmas. It's all or nothing. If you don't come, your whole life is over. In order to make a dramatic decision where he has to decide whether to go back to New York and be there to make the proposal and get the promotion and have all that he's been looking forward to in his life, or give it all up to stay in Rome and pursue the relationship with Lacey. Of course, we know what he did, but that's the same plot device we keep pointing out, and that's why I think it's not too far off the mark to call Ruth the sort of hallmark romance of the Bible. So this resolution, this has to be dealt with. But first, there is this close to Act 3 before we move into the final act. And here it is, beginning in verse 14. "So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before anyone could recognize her." So she didn't have to stay there through the night, but she did. Is anyone else warm besides my wife and me? Yes, I am too. Okay, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm just going to walk all the way off camera, but you can still hear, the recording will still have my voice. She stays, but she's careful to leave before anyone knows she's there. And in fact, he wants her to leave. He's concerned about her reputation. As we said, this would have been scandalous for a woman to be found, even though I don't think there's anything, as we said, there's sexual tension introduced into this with the language that's used, but they're acting honorably and ethically and carefully. So it's not salacious, but it is risky. That's the way we worded it. So she needs to leave. He's careful for her reputation. He said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, bring the garment you were wearing and hold it out. And so she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And so she carries it back. And so then she went into the city. And by the way, that's a little bit of an inclusio, because we're told that she went down to the threshing floor. Now she's going into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "Well, how did you fare, my daughter?" So imagine how anxious Naomi would have been. The narrator is not giving us insights into the feelings of these characters. It's all through the dialogue, but surely we can see how interested and excited Naomi must have been to find out what happened. How did you fare, my daughter? And then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed.'" Oh, that language is, I think, intended to be ironic here as we're going through the story. What did chapter 1? I know we've spread out this study over many weeks, so we lose some of the continuity, but back in chapter 1, you remember what Naomi said when they came back from Moab? In chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, "The Lord has brought me back empty." Brought me back empty. He said, "You must not go back empty-handed." But now we're already seeing the Lord didn't really bring her back empty-handed. And she's not going to end up empty. And this seems to be, even if you look at it as a symbolic gesture, it does give her cover if she's discovered going back from the threshing floor to Naomi. But it also seems to be kind of an earnest, like a promise, sort of a down payment, an assurance of what he wants to give to her and what he's promising to give to her. And so she does not go back empty-handed. She's going to be made full ultimately through what Boaz is going to do on her behalf. So these are the little literary, these little flashes of brilliance that tie the story together so well. Instead of coming out overtly and saying it, we need to look carefully through the story and notice these, how the language is tying in throughout the story, and it really enriches, it really deepens it for us, and creates a deeper appreciation for all the ironies that are taking place in the story. So you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And she replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Now I keep referring to Naomi's intuition, that she understands men, and she understands this man, Boaz. And I think she's basing this not only on the character of Boaz and what they know of him, but on what he has said now, what Ruth has come back and reported. But she seems confident he is not going to rest until he takes care of this. So again, Naomi is acting like the wise friend. Again, I've already seen 2 so far this year, Hallmark movies. I actually cheated on Hallmark and went and watched, we watched part of one on Lifetime. Is that acceptable? Oh, it is? Okay. You know, the ones on Lifetime are a little cheesier, a little lower budget. They're not quite, up to the level, but they're even more cliche and predictable, if that's possible, than the Hallmark ones. But we've already seen in both of them the wise friend who is telling the lead character to follow her heart or go back or whatever the case might be. But that friend, the point is, has this insight, looking at the situation from the outside, knowing what she should do, knowing what's going to happen, right? Are you with me, Jackie? We talked about this. Okay. Jackie's a junkie, too. She was already watching Hallmark Christmas movies before Thanksgiving, which is wrong, but maybe you can be forgiven. So Naomi's like that, to me. She's telling Ruth what he's going to do and how it's going to turn out. Now, this little expression here, this is interesting too. How the matter turns out is literally how the matter will fall. And it's translated literally, sounds like, again, happenstance. Just like chapter 2, verse 3, she happened to come to the field that belonged to Boaz. And behold, along comes Boaz. Remember, we've been noticing these little details along the way, and these comments that seem to suggest this is just happens to fall out this way, just happens to turn out this way. There just happens to be the pile of grain at the end of the threshing floor, which facilitates Ruth being able to slip in secretly to have this encounter with Boaz. It just happens to be that this occurs and that occurs right as soon as we now get into chapter 4. Boaz goes to the gate, and lo and behold, who comes along but the one man he needs to talk to. It almost seems too contrived, like the Hallmark when they bump into each other. That's another cliche, right? They always bump into each other. There was one so violent last night, I thought the guy was going to pummel Lacey Chabert right over onto the ground, the one in Rome. And I'm collecting all those. I'm recording them. And Jackie, I have to show you some of those later. I was looking for them the other day when we were talking. And I found them all. Well, surely that there's another a case where it's ironic, because it seems like he goes to the gate and it just happens to be along comes the one man they need to talk to settle this issue. And so when this language is used, how the matter will fall, it's another suggestion that they're just sort of waiting to see what's going to happen, but really they're trusting God to be directing this. God is the character, the sort of unseen hand, we said when we introduced the book, who's really directing these whole affairs toward the outcome that he is desiring. So God is the character we want to notice through all of this. How the matter will fall. And we'll see that Naomi is right. Immediately, the curtain falls on Act 3, and we come now to the final act. That was the Hallmark Christmas movie thing.
Something like the homeroom, and everybody had to go there early in the morning for announcements?
I don't think so. It's where the elders of the city and the men would meet for business, but it doesn't. I'm not sure. I don't see any indication that it's necessarily scheduled. But if you had business, you would go there, and I take it the elders would be available there. So that's why it seems like, yeah, that's a good question. Like, well, do the men need to meet there to see what the business is for the day? It doesn't appear to be that way. But again, that's why what seems like coincidence or serendipity, whatever, would be providence here. Let's go to finally Act 4, and let's notice how the story ends. So now Boaz had gone up to the gate, and whoops, thank you. Boaz had gone up to the gate, and he sat down there. The gate was sort of like the courthouse. It's where business was conducted, 2 Samuel 15:2. There are several passages that are good indications of that. Job 29, 7 through 17. Job talks about being in the gate. The prominent men, the elders of the city, who were looked to make decisions in the law, in the Pentateuch, we find reference made to cases being settled at the gate. So this is really like sort of court, where if you had a claim that needed to be settled or some issue that needed to be addressed and handled in a formal way, that's where it would take place. So this is important that it's taking place in the gate. So he went to the gate, he sat down, and behold, remember we said that's the writer's way of putting you in to the story. Just like he tells us how carefully Ruth went to the threshing floor and got at Boaz's feet and uncovered his feet. But then we're told, and Boaz woke up, and behold, there's the woman. He's like saying, and look, if you're Boaz, you're waking up and you're seeing there's some woman here right up against me here next to my bed, next to where I'm sleeping. Behold, that's happened several times. Chapter 2, verse 4. Chapter 3, verse 8. Really, it's in chapter 1, too, where Naomi says to Ruth, see, your sister has gone back to her people. You go back as well. Behold, look. It's a way of sort of taking your face and saying, look. Behold. So that's a significant device that we keep paying attention to as we go through the story. The Redeemer. Now watch this. I know it's a little bit hard to see the bottom of the text here, but watch all the places we have Redeemer. Redeemer. Redeem, the verb. Redeem. And then 4 more times down here at the bottom. And we saw that as well in chapter 3 and what Boaz says to Naomi. And so obviously this is a key theme that we talked about, the Gael, the kinsman redeemer who is in a position to step in and save a family member from some distress. We talked about the theology of the Gael and how significant it is to Ruth. So the Redeemer of whom Boaz spoke and came by. So behold, well, look, and we said the one translator put it, the one commentator said, and wouldn't you know it? Well, would you looky here? Who comes along? It's that guy that Boaz was just talking about, the man they need to confront and settle this with. So the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz, turn aside, friend. It's interesting. Does your Bible say friend? Turn aside, friend. It's the Hebrew word is hard to translate. It's from two terms that rhyme, sort of like hocus pocus or helter skelter. And it can be used of land to mean of such and such a place. And really, it could be rendered, turn aside, so-and-so. In other words, it's the writer's way of saying he didn't tell what his name was, right? Like when you're reporting a story to someone and you go, this is the way they talk in Western New York where I'm from, you know. So the guy says to me, he says to me, he goes, and I says to him, so I says, I goes, and then he's like, yada, 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 right? You know, you're not telling him everything he said, you're just saying, okay, then that person was talking, and you're not actually telling him. It's like in Acts when Peter asked Sapphira, did your husband sell the land for such and so? You know, that's how some translations render it. So, because the details of what he's saying are not important, and the person's name isn't important, but it could almost be rendered, one Hebrew scholar says it could be, hey you, like, here, sit down, hey you, come here and sit down here. And so he turned aside and he sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders. So this is what makes it a formal matter. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. All sat down. So watch, see the scene in your mind. And he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative. See, you and I are both kinsmen. Our relative, Elimelech, he's dead now. And she's in need. She needs to sell this property. But if she sells the property, it's going to fall out of the line of Elimelech. So we're in a position to be able to do something about that. So he explains that to her. Verse 4, so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. And if you will redeem it, redeem it. Remember we said the chesed of the Lord, this steadfast love, that it acts boldly and takes risks and is courageous and is daring, all of that, but it's also ethical. It's also ethical that he's following the proper procedure rather than trying to circumvent that or hide that or just act without the man's knowing and seal the matter. He is behaving ethically even though it's risking what he and Ruth both want. So in other words, they're doing what they can and then leaving it in the hands of the Lord, right? And so we said that's how God's provision works for us. We don't just sit back and pray, Lord, give us this day our daily bread, and then expect when we go to the cupboard it's just going to be filled with food. Well, we know we pray to God and we rely on God and we God, but then we act as far as we are able to act, and then we trust God to work in the circumstances and for the outcome to be according to His will. And so that's why He's taking this extraordinary measure. So He says, if you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. Now He doesn't say, look, I know you're before me and you could redeem this land, but I really want to redeem it because I want to marry this woman. I want to marry Elimelech's daughter-in-law. I want to marry Naomi's dead son's wife, Ruth, who came back with her. So look, could you just let it fall to me and I'll take care of it? He could have told him all that and persuaded him. He just states it very matter-of-factly. If you want to redeem it, go ahead and redeem it. It's yours. And if you don't, then I will. So it increases the tension a bit that he's not really persuading and pleading. So here comes the crucial climax of the book right here. And he said, I will redeem it. So he said, I will. And so for a moment, that seems to dash the hopes that all of this appears to have been leading toward. Oh, and I will take it. Well, wait a minute. that's not supposed to be what's going to happen. But, of course, Boaz is sort of baiting him, right? Boaz is letting him decide and then springing the condition on him. See, it makes it a little more dramatic, doesn't it? So in verse 5, then Boaz said, okay, but the day the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead and his inheritance. Now, this is a bit strange because this isn't really something the law of Moses required. The levirate law we said from the Latin lever, which means brother-in-law, in Deuteronomy 25, that required if your brother passed away and his widow had no son, then a brother was to go into that woman and allow her to have a child, and so that child could then inherit what was the dead brother's inheritance. Okay, that was the levirate marriage, it's called. But this idea of the property being linked to that was not a part of Moses. It was apparently a custom in Israel of this time to link those two things together. So you had the patrimonial inheritance, the inheritance of Elimelech, and then you had the raising up a descendant, and that was a brother, and neither of these is an immediate brother, so they're a kinsman, but a more distant relative. So really, neither is absolutely obligated. They have the right to, they have the opportunity to, but not the obligation to. I did a whole sermon where I talked about how that steadfast love, the hesed we keep mentioning, acts willingly. And even when it's not necessary, does what is good for another. Even when it's not compelled or absolutely obligatory, that it acts freely and lavishly and generously. So they're not actually required to do this, either one of them. But if they do, the custom in Israel at that time was to link the two together. So that's why he says, okay, but Ruth is part of the deal. Now, this is the key moment in the whole story. What's he going to say? What's he going to do? What does he say? Verse 6, then the Redeemer said, and everyone's waiting, right? I guess this is where you'd pan back and then you'd zoom in and you'd have some music to sort of make it more dramatic, and maybe he'd take a few steps and think for a minute and pause and maybe sound like he's going to say yes or whatever. But this is the tension. This is the big dramatic moment. And then the Redeemer said, what? What's it going to be? Imagine if you're telling the story orally, because Israel, the people of Israel didn't have their own, they didn't have their own copies of Scripture, and so these stories were related orally. So that's how I would tell it. I'd really drag it out like I just did. So the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So if he has another child through this Ruth, even though that child, the land then stays in the family line, somehow, not explained here, that will be a problem for the inheritance he's going to leave to his descendants. And he doesn't want that complication. So at first he said, yes, I'll take it. Oh, wait, Ruth comes with the deal. I'm going to have more descendants. And they're going to be tangled now in this other situation, and it creates a problem for my inheritance. And so we don't have time to explore how all that might be. But he says, take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And so this great sigh of relief. Now this is very interesting, and we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at it, but it's explained even to the generation who received this literature of the Israelites, because even then they wouldn't have understood what this was. So this was really an ancient custom that even at the time the book of Ruth was written had to be explained to later generations. And it's very strange to us. But now this was the custom in former times, verse 7. In former times in Israel, concerning redeeming and exchanging, to confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of fasting in Israel. It seems very bizarre to us. To draw off your sandal. Excuse me, I need to do what you're doing. I need to cough for a second.
This was the first BOGO. So
Buy a field, get a woman. That sounds like a pretty good deal. That Psalm 60 and verse 8 might be a reference to this practice. There are a couple references in the prophets as well. In Deuteronomy, if a man refused to raise up descendants for his brother's widow, she was to take off her sandal and throw it at him and spit on his face. And it was a way of publicly humiliating him. It's a different custom, but it's related as far as the idea of the sandal, like you just throw the sandal. It was an insult. Remember, someone threw a shoe at George Bush at a press conference years ago. Remember that? So I wonder if that's still a custom in that part of the world. But that's a little bit different thing. Here it was a way, it's something to formalize matters. You didn't have notary republics. You didn't have the same kind of documentation of events and transactions like we do. So it's very interesting to see that little detail. So in verse 8, so when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders of all the people, you are witnesses this day. I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon, and also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Notice the statement begins and ends. Verse 9. You are witnesses this day, yada, yada, yada. You are witnesses this day, right? That's another one of those literary tools, that repetition. And you see it a lot in the Bible, that inclusio, as we've pointed it out. All right, so we're on a roll. Let's keep going. So then all the people who are at the gate, this turns into this great joyous thing. Let me look at our time. And the elders said, we are witnesses. So they acknowledged, and that formalized and finalized the deal. But notice what they said. Notice the graciousness. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house. Now this is quite a generous blessing to wish upon this Moabite woman, to wish that she would, this magnanimity is really something to behold, because they're saying, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, the matriarchs of all of the sons who form the 12 tribes of Israel. May the Lord make this Moabite like her, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah. Now notice the parallelism we keep pointing out all the way back to the beginning when Naomi first speaks, that there is poetic element. The way they're speaking is related in Hebrew parallelism, in poetic form, to impress upon us how to make more of an impact. The beauty of the language helps impress upon us the beauty of what's taking place. So may you act worthily in Ephrathah, and may you be renowned in Bethlehem. That's worthily and renowned. This is a great example of Hebrew parallelism. Now, people didn't speak in poetic verse to each other, but this is a way of relating what they said in a poetic way, so the story is even more beautiful to us. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Why is Tamar being brought into this? Judah, you remember, refused to give his son. When Judah's son died and Tamar had no child, Judah refused to give his other son to her. After he promised he would, he refused to. And you remember, she tricked him into, essentially, she pretended to be a prostitute, and he slept with her, thinking he was just going out of town to see a prostitute, and then she became pregnant with the child, and so it's a scandalous story. But it seems that they're wishing this and bringing her into the picture because it was the levirate situation. It was a situation of a woman who did not have a son and who needed someone who would play the part of a Gael like that. And so that seems to be the point of bringing that into the picture, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. All right, so now let's watch it, because we're getting to a very important part. I might cut you short, Barry. Okay. Quickly. Go ahead.
The nearest kinsman redeemer refused to provide seed for her. He left spill on the ground, so that she was forced to do that. Because the nearest kinsman redeemer went into Tamar, but he let his seed still on the ground, and the Lord killed him. He was the nearest kinsman redeemer. He was the brother.
I like Onan, like the situation with Onan. Yeah, that's a different situation. But yeah, there was an outright refusal to play the part.
Right.
Well, in verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her is the typical biblical euphemism for marital intimacy, for sexual intimacy. And the Lord gave her conception. One of the rare times, only twice in the book. Remember we said back in chapter 1, is it back in chapter 1 verse 13, where we're told the Lord visited his people with bread, and here we're told the Lord gave her conception. He's basically been hinting that the Lord's been working in all of this, but only twice, once at the beginning of the book and once at the end, does he explicitly say the Lord caused this. So children were viewed as a gift from the Lord, a gift of God's grace. That when a woman conceives, it's a gift from the Lord. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And then the women said to Naomi, now the women's reaction to when Naomi returns from Moab, that's in Act 1, at the end of Act 1. And here the women sort of bracket the whole story in inclusio. Their reaction comes now at the end of Act 4. The women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." And so to bless the Lord is to praise God. It's to worship God. Blessed be the Lord. They express worship. Their reaction to this is to give glory to God. He shall be to you a restorer of life, a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, and remember this, she said, God brought me back empty. And we get to the end and we see she's now been made full. Her life, it's a restoring of life. Your daughter, all this was made possible because this is not the word chesed, it's the word ahav, but it shows, it's the word, the more general word for love, but we've seen over and over in the book, this is a steadfast love. It's a covenant love. It's a faithful love. It's a love manifested in lavish and generous kindness. Your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. Remember when Elkanah foolishly says that to Hannah when she wasn't able to have children, and she was in agony and bitterness over it. And he said, well, what's the matter, honey? Don't you have me? Aren't I better to you than 7 sons? So that's a proverbial expression. For something to be better to you than 7 sons means wow. It means something tremendous. So may he be more to you than 7 sons. Ruth is more to you than 7 sons. That's how precious Ruth is. Now, she's not really on the stage here for the close of this story. It all now shifts to Naomi because it's the lineage now that we're leading to that is Naomi's husband's. So watch this. So Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name. Now this is strange that the women name him. This is very unusual. Saying, a son has been born to whom? Naomi. Well, it was born to Ruth. But clearly they see this is the hand of God working to provide an heir for Naomi's line. So the story really, we said it could have been called the Book of Naomi instead of the Book of Ruth. It's really now coming back full circle to focus on Naomi. And they named an Obed, and Obed was the granddaddy of someone very, very important. And that leads us to he's the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now the book ends very unusually, very unusual. These are the generations. No! I command you to remain for a moment. You can all leave. I'm going to finish the book here. These are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And so this line, this genealogy goes back. It goes back in time, and it stretches forward in time. And that link with Jesse and David, of course, matters because it is leading to David the king, and it's leading to David's son, the King of Kings. And then these are among the verses that identify Jesus as the son of David, the root of Jesse, the offspring of David. And that the preaching of the gospel that we see, for example, in the book of Acts, here and in Acts chapter 2, I think what I'll do is I am going to just do a final word or two to tie all this together with these prophecies, and then Wednesday at the very beginning of class, and then we can do the introduction to the Gospels, because I wanted to look quickly at how this is all tied together here with Acts 13. But when the gospel is preached, we're told it was God keeping his promise to raise up the seed of David to give his descendant a king who would reign forever and ever. What I want you to see, though, is this, is how this little story is really, of these characters, is part of the big story of history. And that this shows us that seemingly random events in history have a purpose. That history has a purpose, and it's God's purpose. And your story is a part of the big story as well. And that God is working out a bigger purpose in your life and in mine. Just like that genealogy stretches back and then it stretches forward in time. See, that genealogy links our history, our little moment here in history, with the hand of God working through history in the big picture to bring about his purpose to save you through the son of the grandson of Boaz and Ruth, the greater son of David, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, to save you and bring glory to his name through Jesus Christ. Maybe we'll do this. How about for the lesson tonight, I wasn't going to do this, we'll wrap that up by looking at those prophecies in Acts, and then I'll include that with the other videos. But what a beautiful, powerful story, the book of Ruth. Thank you for the time we could share together looking at this.